Good Wednesday evening and welcome to the May program of the Lewis Sky History Series. I am Peggy McPhillips. I'm president of the Norfolk Historical Society, and on behalf of our board, I welcome you to this evening's program. It is going to be so good. You're going to love it. The program is Carlos P. Romulo, The Voice of Freedom on Corregidor and Bataan. It is about a gentleman named Carlos Romulo, who was a journalist, statesman, diplomat, soldier, and author of more than 20 books. He was Philippine native and served with General MacArthur during World War II, reaching the rank of general in both the United States and Philippine armies. But he didn't stop there. He was president of the United States Nations General Assembly in 1949 and 50. He was four-time president of the United Nations Security Council. And he was recognized by organizations and academic institutions and nations around the world. He had many, many awards, including 74 honorary academic degrees, 144 awards and decorations, including the 1942 Pulitzer Prize for Correspondence and a 1952 nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. The program tonight is brought to us by someone who knew him well, his grandson, Dr. Rodrigo Romulo, who lives in the area now. And he will talk to us a little bit more about his grandfather, highlighting especially his experiences of events on Corregidor and Bataan during World War II, December of 41 to April of 42. And he will read excerpts of the general's own words from his writings and conversations with MacArthur, our own General MacArthur. Dr. Romulo is the fourth of 10 grandchildren of General Romulo. He has some achievements of his own. He obtained his medical degree from the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, internal medicine residency at St. Luke's Hospital in Cleveland and the Miriam Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. Finished his fellowship in infectious diseases from Brown University and practiced infectious and tropical disease medicine in Makati, Philippines, which is his hometown, for many years. He was chairman of the Philippine Coalition Against Tuberculosis and led the development of the National Tuberculosis Control Policy of the Philippines. He served for 6 years as an advisor in tuberculosis to the World Health Organization. He came to the United States, we're very glad, in 2004. He is the founder of the Tidewater Infectious Disease Physicians. It includes 3 other infectious disease physicians and a nurse practitioner. He practices mainly at the Chesapeake Regional Medical Center. He did practice at Bon Secours DePaul before it closed, but he serves as the member of the board of directors of Bon Secours Mercy, Hampton Roads. The General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. Our own board member, Bill Davis, asked if we would like to have a program by Dr. Romulo about his grandfather, and we just snapped that right up. Additionally, in addition to being a physician, he is president of and he grows bonsai. So we're very glad to have him. I will remind you all, and especially those who have not been here before, there is on your screen, there's a chat feature or a question and answer feature. And if you will write down any questions that you have during the program, I'll keep a track of them, and we will throw them all at Dr. Romulo at the end. So I am going to turn the program over now to Dr. Rod Romulo, who will tell us about his grandfather. Dr. Romulo?
Thank you very much, Peggy, and thank you to the Norfolk Historical Society for giving me this opportunity to speak about my grandfather, the late General Carlos Romulo. Let me pull up my screen here to start. Yes, and I thank the Society for allowing me to use this beautiful graphic that the webmaster Jason made as my title slide. General Romulo he had a remarkable life story, and it was an inspiration to many in the Philippines and beyond, but he also has a special connection with the city of Norfolk, and I'll explain why. And you probably recognize this iconic photograph of General MacArthur landing in Leyte at the start of the campaign to retake or liberate the Philippines. General Romulo is the little man standing behind him. And as you know, this picture is displayed in the MacArthur Memorial in downtown Norfolk. Not only in the one of the display cases, but this scene is also reproduced as a gigantic mural in one of the stairwells. And also it is in an enormous wood carving donated by the Philippine government that hangs in the theater at the visitor center. So Carlos Romulo is all over the MacArthur Memorial. And in 1975, my family, when I just graduated from high school, my family came to the United States on a visit. My mother, my sister, my younger brother. But before we left Manila, my grandfather instructed us, and it wasn't a suggestion, he instructed us to go to Norfolk, Virginia, to the MacArthur Memorial. Not to see MacArthur, but to see him in the memorial. And we did so and had a good time. But I never imagined that almost 30 years later, I would move my own family from the Philippines to live in this area. We now live in nearby Chesapeake. But much less did I ever dream that I would have the great privilege of serving on the board of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation that runs the memorial. And that's a true honor that I appreciate. I've come to recognize that the MacArthur Memorial is such a treasure, not just for the city of Norfolk, or for Virginia, or for the United States, but for anyone in the world who comes to visit and is informed by the events that are immortalized there. And before I proceed, I would like to recognize the amazing staff that works tirelessly to make all the live and virtual activities at the memorial possible. Of course, I'm referring to our co-directors, Jim Zobel and Amanda Williams, who was one of your recent speakers here at this forum, our curator, Corey Thornton, and of course, our executive director, Colonel Bill Davis. I just wanted to recognize the outstanding work that they do. I'd also like to thank Chris Kolakowski, our former director at the MacArthur Memorial, who was also one of your recent speakers here. Before he left Norfolk, Chris gifted me with a copy of his book, Last Stand on Bataan. And he told me that he had drawn heavily on my grandfather's book, I Saw the Fall of the Philippines, which I will tell you about shortly. Well, we're coming full circle now because I have taken a few army maps reproduced in Chris's book to help tell my grandfather's story tonight. This is a cover of the book, I Saw the Fall of the Philippines, which will be my main reference tonight. And as you heard in the introduction, I'm not a historian, so please don't expect a extensively referenced scholarly dissertation on the topic, but I do have an interesting, I think amazing story that is woven from extended excerpts from this book, interjected with some pictures and maps that I've fished out from the internet to help illustrate the story. But it's mainly from this book, which begins with Romulo's travels as a journalist in the late 1941, at the start of the Japanese attack on the Philippines in December, and his experiences in Corregidor and Bataan until his escape in April 1942. Note that I default to the Filipino pronunciation of Bataan. And Corregidor is a Spanish word, and the Filipino pronunciation is the same as the Spanish, Corregidor. I have also drawn from the sequel to this book, I See the Philippines Rise, published in 1946, which includes events leading up to the landing in Leyte that I just showed in the opening picture, and also from the Romulo autobiography, I Walked with Heroes, published in 1961. John Whitman's book, Bataan, Our Last Ditch, is a monumental work on this topic and was a great reference. And my thanks to Jim Sobel for directing me to this book. So now, before focusing on the events on Bataan and Corregidor, allow me to share with you the highlights of Carlos P. Romulo's post-war career. At the founding of the United Nations in 1945, he signed the UN Charter for the Philippines. In 1949, he was elected president of the 4th United Nations General Assembly, becoming the first Asian to serve that position. He became the Philippine representative to the United Nations and served as president of the UN Security Council 4 times. He eventually served under 8 Philippine presidents, as Secretary of Education, and mostly as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He also served as president of the University of the Philippines. He continued in public service until the age of 85, when he resigned for health reasons. He accrued numerous awards and decorations in his lifetime, including the highest civilian awards of the United States. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was awarded by President Ronald Reagan in 1984. And posthumously in 2019, he received the Congressional Gold Medal, together with other Filipino war veterans. He died in December of 1985 and was buried at the National Heroes Cemetery in the Philippines. So let me situate our story tonight with the help of some maps. For those who aren't familiar where the Philippines is, we're here on the east coast of the United States, going west. We go to Southeast Asia, and the Philippines is on the eastern side of Southeast Asia. This is a modern map, and the place names are not what they were in 1941, but you can see where Indochina was, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, and here's the Philippines. I want to point out Australia down at the bottom is important in our story. Apparently, this is the place to escape to when you're being bombed by Japanese on Bataan. And a closer look at the Philippines and some historical milestones. The Philippines became an American territory in 1898, when, as part of the hostilities of the Spanish-American War, Admiral George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. It's right there. And later that year, Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. The Filipino revolutionaries against Spain had already declared an independent republic and were naturally angered by the arrival of a new colonizer, and a 3-year Philippine-American War ensued. This ended in the defeat of the militarily outmatched Filipinos and the establishment of a U.S. civilian government in 1902. In 1934, the U.S. passed the Philippine Independence Act. This is the U.S. Congress passed the Philippine Independence Act that established the process for the Philippines to become an independent country after a 10-year period as the Commonwealth of the Philippines. The Commonwealth was inaugurated in 1935, and this is the era around which our story begins. And before I leave this map, let me just point out two locations. The island of Cebu, right here, and the town of Iloilo, right there. And these will become important when I describe the escape from Bataan. Just more focus on Luzon, where the Bataan Peninsula is, Manila here. A closer view will show you more clearly this peninsula on the western end of Manila Bay. Manila is right here. And this tadpole-shaped island is Corregidor. So now the stage is set for the story. This is pre-war Manila. It was a beautiful city and a delightful place to live. It was called the Pearl of the Orient and the Paris of the East. Romulo was already a successful newspaperman at the time. He had become a close associate of his hero, Manuel L. Quezon, the charismatic leader who advocated for Philippine independence, which he believed could only be achieved by working with America in its democratic system. Quezon was the idol of the Filipino youth who were inspired by his zeal for independence and democracy and his faith in America. In 1928, Romulo met Douglas MacArthur, who came to the Philippines as a brigadier general, heading the Philippine Scouts, whose mission it was to train young Filipinos for military life. MacArthur was already celebrated as an American war hero at the time. He was later to become Romulo's greatest heroes, one of Romulo's greatest heroes. But at first, their relationship was just social. Romulo writes in his autobiography, quote, "My wife and I became close friends of the MacArthurs. They came to our home, and Virginia," yes, my grandmother's name was Virginia. "Virginia and I visited in their beautiful apartment in Manila Hotel. It was a friendship that was to lead into the tunnel on Corregidor," close quote. In 1935, Quezon was elected president of the Philippine Commonwealth, and he made MacArthur his military advisor. This color-coded map shows you where the Western colonial powers in Southeast Asia were at the time. In the pink or magenta, whatever this color is the British colonies, Burma and Malaya. Blue is French Indochina. Orange, of course, was the Dutch in Indonesia. Little green here is Portugal. And of course, at the time, the Philippines that had been Spanish was now under the United States. In 1941, at MacArthur's suggestion, Carlos Romulo traveled through the Far East and wrote about how subject peoples in Malaysia, Burma, Thailand, Indochina, and Indonesia felt about their Western rulers. He wrote 45 newspaper articles warning that Asia was vulnerable to Japanese aggression. These articles were to later win for Romulo the Pulitzer Prize. Returning after several weeks to Manila, he met with MacArthur, who anticipated war was coming and planned to engage Romulo's services when it did. 2 weeks later, on December 7, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the next day, the Philippines. A few days later, during an air raid, MacArthur phoned, calling Romulo to active duty. He was inducted that afternoon as major in the Philippine Army by Major General Basilio J. Valdez, Philippine Army Chief of Staff. Romulo was to have charge of press and radio of the USAFE, the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, under MacArthur's command. He issued press releases to newspapermen. He wrote and arranged radio programs to inform the public of the dangerous situation in the Philippines. On December 10, the Japanese began an invasion of Luzon up in the north. Romulo started his job with USAFE on December 17, and a few days later, in one of the relentless Japanese air raids, he was thrown spread eagle onto the street pavement by a bomb landing 100 feet away. And as he began to recover, he became drenched in the blood of a man who was hit directly by a second bomb 50 feet away. The bombings continued day after day. On December 20, the Japanese landed another invasion force on the island of Mindanao in the south. And on December 24th, the ailing President Quezon and MacArthur's advanced echelon evacuated from Manila to the island fortress of Corregidor. Just a reminder, here's Manila. It was being bombed, and to evacuate to Corregidor, you have to take the ferry to this island here. This Corregidor was the tadpole-shaped island at the mouth of Manila Bay, just south of Bataan Peninsula, where the combined Filipino and American forces would eventually retreat, attempting to hold out until relief forces came from the U.S. Romulo was to remain in Manila with the rear echelon that was assigned 3 tasks: demolition of anything of possible use to the oncoming Japanese, keeping MacArthur in contact with the forces on the field, and maintaining supply lines. By December 26, the city was disarmed and Manila was declared an open city so that the Japanese could occupy it without further attack. But by December 28, the Japanese resumed bombing of the now defenseless city. The rear echelon evacuated to Corregidor on New Year's Day, 1942. On Corregidor, you see in the inset picture the island. The Malinta Tunnel had a large main tunnel and extensions called laterals. So here's the main tunnel and the extensions called the laterals, with the largest being the hospital lateral that had about a dozen smaller laterals of its own. This is the Malinta Tunnel that tourists can visit nowadays, but it wasn't always as clean and bright as this. Romulo describes the initial shock of entering the tunnel. Quote, "The smell of the place hit me like a blow in the face. There was the stench of sweat and dirty clothes, the coppery smell of blood and disinfectant coming from the lateral where the hospital was located. And all over, the heavy stink of creosote, hanging like a blanket in the air that moved sluggishly when it moved at all." This is the hospital. That's one of the smaller hospital laterals. I quote again, "Soldiers were sleeping along the sides of the tunnel, on cots, on ammunition cases, or curled up on the cement floor. Their boots were in one another's faces. Ambulances rolled within a few inches of their heads. The bombs that fell night and day shook the foremost stone laterals of the tunnel." This is the lateral that was the office of the USAFE. As Romulo searched the squalid and chaotic surroundings to find President Quezon, it occurred to him that only a few weeks earlier, he had seen the president at the Malacanang Palace overlooking the Pasig River. Quezon was suffering from tuberculosis, but convalescing in the luxury of the presidential palace. Now, he found the president in a small lateral lined with about 40 beds. Quote, I heard him coughing, and his weak voice called out to me, hello, Romulo. He was propped up by pillows on a white iron hospital bed. A white cloth partition separated the bed from the latrine and the washstands. Under the sheet, his emaciated body looked like a skeleton. His gray hair was long and tangled. But Quezon's eyes held their old fire, their burning intensity. Romulo, he began eagerly, have you read President Roosevelt's statement that help is on the way and that our independence will be established and protected? He somehow remained optimistic and in high spirits. End of quote. This is a picture of General MacArthur and Quezon on Corregidor, and you can see from the picture evidence of Quezon's failing health. According to the original U.S. war plan, U.S. defense forces were supposed to withdraw into the peninsula of Bataan and await the arrival of a relief expedition. But MacArthur was mistakenly convinced that his forces could defeat the Japanese invaders on the beaches. When the Filipino-American forces were repeatedly beaten or brushed aside by the Japanese army under the command of General Masaharu Homma, MacArthur ordered them to withdraw into Bataan after all. The Japanese tried to cut them off, but in a series of fierce battles during the first week of January, the Filipino-American allies slipped past them. And after that, the Filipino-American army found itself besieged on Bataan. Quezon was eager to establish a radio broadcast from Corregidor to communicate with the outside world. He and MacArthur ordered Romulo to get one started as soon as possible. This is a picture of Romulo with a microphone there. It is actually on Leyte, but I didn't have one with a radio on Corregidor. By January 5th, Romulo started the first broadcast of The Voice of Freedom. To disguise the location of the broadcast, his opening line was always, quote, people of the Philippines, you are listening to the voice of freedom from the battlefront of Bataan, close quote. He and his colleagues would prepare broadcast messages of encouragement to the entire Philippines 3 times daily, morning, noon, and night. Within an hour of the initial broadcast, the Japanese KZRH in Manila responded with boasts and threats, and thus began the propaganda war over the airwaves for the hearts and minds of the Filipino people. Romulo was already a marked man because of his prior anti-Japanese articles, but soon the Japanese would offer a reward for his capture, dead or alive. He writes, quote, from the beginning, the voice of freedom was the courage of MacArthur and the patriotism of Quezon. Over it, they could get in touch with the soldiers and the people. On Corregidor and Bataan, we had our heroes. We told their exploits over the voice of freedom. End quote. Filipinos in the countryside were listening to the voice of freedom, transcribing them and distributing mimeographed copies to those without radios. Reports reached Corregidor that men found with these mimeographed copies in their pockets were shot by the Japanese. Separated from his wife and 4 boys since evacuating to Corregidor, and receiving a brief message from them only once since, Romulo knew they were hiding at some unknown location in fear of Japanese vengeance. One night, he delivered the following radio message, quote, "With my eyes closed and with my heart in my throat, knowing that wherever they might be, if it were humanly possible, they would be listening in." Hello, father, mother, brother, sister. Hello, darling, my sweetheart, my wife. I have come from the front to say a few words to you. So listen closely, wherever you are, in an empty barn, somewhere in Bulacan, in some secluded barrio on the shore of Cebu, or in a darkened room in Manila with the window shut against the passing patrol. Come closer. This is your son, your brother, your sweetheart, your husband, who speaks to you in the name of all the fighting men in the hills of Bataan. Be courageous and prudent. Do not offer any useless resistance. Yield as far as honor will allow, but no farther. Remember that if you cooperate with the Japanese, you are fighting against me, against all of us. The rice that is harvested from your fields, the scrap iron collected from your streets and yards, is used to feed the inhuman war machine that has separated us and desolated our country. The ammunition that is being made in Manila is being used against us. Those very same bullets may kill your son, your husband. And now, goodbye for a little while, father, mother, brother, sister, my darling, my sweetheart, my wife. Be of good cheer in your silent houses. Sleep quietly through the night of defeat. Gather strength for the morning. We will come back sooner than you think. End quote. He would make several trips to the front lines on Bataan. He was determined to bring to the boys in the foxholes President Roosevelt's message, quote, that your freedom will be redeemed and that your independence established and protected. The entire resources in men and materials of the United States have been mobilized behind that pledge, close quote. He described the foxholes on Bataan, quote, they were trenches open to the blinding sun and to enemy bullets. Some were round like a pit and held a single boy. Others were dug at an angle and held several soldiers. The boys had dug the foxholes themselves with their bayonets, others with picks and shovels. Many had dug their own graves. The smell of rotting flesh permeated Bataan. Romulo visited foxhole after foxhole, bringing messages of encouragement from MacArthur and Quezon, as well as Roosevelt's message. Quote, they had only one question: when is help coming? I assured them, as I had their officers, soon. January turned to February, and still no reinforcements came. Quezon's health deteriorated, and he and his party, including his wife and daughters, and Vice President Osmeña, were evacuated off Corregidor to a yet unoccupied territory of the Philippines. The message to the boys in Bataan became, hang on until April. The U.S. and Philippine troops were being ravaged by exhaustion, starvation, and disease. This is the field hospital on Bataan. which is actually also bombed by the Japanese in a few days. Romulo himself had a recurrence of the malaria he contracted in Burma, with its episodes of shaking chills, fever, and sweats. He recognized the symptoms in General Vicente Lim, the fearless Filipino leader on Bataan, who pointed out that a third of his boys in the foxholes were dying from malaria and dysentery, and there were no medicines to give them, and no food. On March 6, Lieutenant General Richard K. Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, pulled Romulo aside for a confidential message. Quote, General MacArthur has been ordered out by the first available transportation. He is leaving Corregidor tonight. Close quote. Later, Romulo recalled, MacArthur clapped me on the shoulder. Carlos, I want to talk with you. We went outside the lateral into the tunnel. I'm placing Wainwright in command. He's the best soldier I have. Bataan can stand, but if any crisis comes and I'm needed here, I'm coming back, alone if necessary. Close quote. MacArthur gave Romulo the choice of leaving with him or staying in the tunnel with Lieutenant General Wainwright, who would now be in command on Corregidor. Romulo hesitatingly chose to stay. I knew you'd say that, Carlos, MacArthur said. The voice of freedom can't be stilled. It must go on. It's our voice. Go to Bataan. Talk to the boys for me. Tell them I had to do this, and they are to believe me when I say it is for the best. Tell them that my heart is with them, Carlos. Romulo wrote, he went on to assure me that if Bataan should fall and Corregidor prove untenable, he would see that a plane was sent for me. Close quote. Here's a picture of General MacArthur with General Wainwright on Corregidor. It was not until March 17th that they learned that Douglas MacArthur had entered Melbourne, Australia, a hero, to the sound of cheering and the flutter of flags. His words, quote, I came through and I shall return, close quote, were received like a personal message to those anxiously waiting on Corregidor. Romulo continued to broadcast the voice of freedom and make his dangerous trips to the foxholes on Bataan. For this, he was awarded the Purple Heart. On March 31, they learned that Quezon had joined MacArthur in Australia. The situation on Bataan deteriorated steadily that first week of April. Quote, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on April 8, Wainwright sent for me. Quote, I'm ordering you out of Corregidor. Bataan is hopeless. At 7 tonight, take the little launch to Bataan. Go to the Bataan airfield. From there, you will take off for Mindanao, where you will report to General Rojas and General Sharp. Here are your secret orders, close quote. Romulo replied, goodbye, sir. He stiffly saluted. Then Wainwright came around the table and shook my hand warmly. God bless you, my boy. Tell President Quezon and General MacArthur, I will do my best to the end. This is a picture straight out of the book, which is, the caption says, the boat on which Colonel Romulo escaped from Corregidor. And I show it just, you can hardly see the boat, but there it is. And this is General Wainwright in the center there. And this is a not a very clear slide. That's why I've added arrows of my own. This is the peninsula of Bataan and Corregidor on the bottom. It will set the stage for the rest of the story. This is the U.S. Army map illustrating the Japanese advance from April 7 to 9, 1942. Take note of Corregidor and the town of Cabcaben at the bottom. The arrows are mine to highlight the timeline and position of the retreating U.S. lines. So they're retreating south this way. This rapid southward retreat from the afternoon of April 7 to the moment of our story, the night of April 8. So imagine a massive horde of men in vehicles swarming in disorganized, chaotic retreat southwards towards Cabcaben along 2 dirt roads. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had built 4 gravel airfields in what appears to be the area around Cabcaben. I could not pinpoint the exact location of these airfields, but the one called Bataan Airfield appears to have been located further inland, closer to the town of Cabcaben. So Romulo had to make the trip from Corregidor to Cabcaben and then to the Bataan Airfield further inland. I'll leave this slide up as I return to the story. The little launch left for Bataan just as, for the first time, Corregidor was being shelled from the peninsula. The enemy had captured some of their guns and were firing at Corregidor. 3 Japanese planes flew low and followed the launch, at first without shooting, then opened up with machine gun fire. The boat jerked from the heavy slugs. 2 men beside Romulo slumped dead to the bottom of the boat. After another strafing run, the Japanese pilots banked sharply away, presuming all were dead. Miraculously, no one else was hit. By this time, they had reached Cabcaben, but found there was no dock. Cabcaben had just been heavily bombed. The launch was close to the shore, but still in deep water, with sharks visible nearby. Using bamboo poles as a gangplank, a certain Lieutenant Edwards assisted a shaken Romulo onto the shore over the slippery poles. There was confusion and chaos and dust clouds from cars rumbling towards the shore as Lieutenant Edwards stayed with Romulo to search for a certain Captain Louis Bell, who was to meet him and take him to the Bataan Airfield. Unable to find Captain Bell amidst the chaos, Edwards commandeered an army car, telling the driver named Packer, quote, "Listen, soldier, this man is Colonel Romulo. You know, MacArthur's friend, Quezon's friend, the guy that does all the sassing back to the Japs on the Voice of Freedom. Wainwright wants him off Bataan tonight. Take care of him. Take him to the Bataan Airfield," close quote. That car inched its way against the massive flow of vehicles retreating towards the shore and took hours before nearing the Bataan Airfield. As they approached the Bataan Airfield, the Japanese were actively shelling the area, and as they arrived, they found the headquarters blacked out. The airfield had been evacuated. Romulo directed Packer to drive to the nearby motor pool, where he knew there was a telephone. He was going to call General Wainwright and tell him about the predicament he was in, unaware that the communication lines between Corregidor and Bataan had been cut off. And here's a picture to tell us what he meant by telephone. No smartphones in those days. At the motor pool phone, as Romulo was helplessly jiggling the receiver, an officer stepped up saying, "Are you Colonel Romulo? We have orders for you from Corregidor." He was to go to the Cabcaben Airfield and ask for Lieutenant Barnack, who would have a plane for him. "Oh God," was Packer's response when told to drive to the Cabcaban airfield. Planes were droning overhead and shells and bombs were crashing down on the Cabcaban airfield when Packer stopped our car at the edge. "The next time you hear a shell whistle," I said, "cut across the field." There was the whistle, off to our right, and we were off like a shot. The shell exploded harmlessly at the far end of the field. Another shell blew up the earth just in back of us. We kept going. We jounced over the field, skirting shell holes until I saw a light gleaming in a thicket. I yelled at Parker to stop. I howled, "Lieutenant Barnick!" A voice came back. "Is that Colonel Romulo?" My yes over the battle's thunder could have been heard in Tokyo. In the thicket was a group of men in overalls who were working by flashlight on a plane hidden under bamboo. It was the funniest looking plane I had ever seen. It looked like something reclaimed from a city dump. End quote. At this point, I should mention that Romulo never saw Lieutenant Edwards or the soldier named Packer ever again, but he repeatedly mentions in his book that they saved his life. The plane was a Grumman J2 F4 that was repaired with parts fished out of a similar plane sunk in the bay. Just to help us visualize this, I picked this off the internet picture of the J2 F4 Grumman. Barnick later wrote a letter describing their adventure, and the letter was included in the book. He listed several factors which made the takeoff and flight a precarious one. First, the plane was overloaded. It was meant for 4 and they had 6 passengers. Second, the propeller was stuck in low RPM. Third, Barnick had never flown a J2 F4 before. And next, there was no lighting in the cockpit. And this was midnight. The men had been working on it for 2 days and 2 nights with the final adjustments made by flashlight on midnight of April 8th. They nicknamed the plane the Old Duck. On first attempt, the engine fired and kept running. There was little time for testing the ship. Barnick describes in his letter, quote, "We succeeded in taking off Cabcaban field by bouncing the plane, retracting the landing gear, and as we cleared the edge of the field, we settled to within a few inches of the water. Our load was too great. We managed to maintain 70 feet of altitude. But after 15 minutes of flight, we threw all our baggage, parachutes, etc. overboard, thus making it possible to climb to 125 feet. And as the fuel load was consumed, we were able to climb to an altitude of 300 or 400 feet, close quote. Both Japanese and Filipino-American gunners took shots at the plane, but it wasn't until later that they learned a couple of bullets ripped through the side of the plane. Back to Romulo's narration. Quote, "Before throwing my bag out, I fished into it for my wife's picture and the packet of typewritten tissue that was the diary I kept every day in Corregidor. I put these inside my shirt. I kept my dispatch case because it held important papers and the letters that my friends in the tunnel had entrusted to me when they found that I was leaving." He fell asleep, but later, quote, "I woke up with a feeling of nervous apprehension. Barnick had figured on our having just enough gas to make Cebu, but hours had passed, and surely Cebu could not take that much flying time, even at the Old Duck speed. At last, I felt the reassuring pitch of the plane as Barnick nosed it down." End quote. But as they broke through the clouds, they saw, quote, long white ribbons of searchlights groping up through the clouds, searching out our wretched little plane. We knew instantly that those searchlights could only be pointing from the decks of enemy cruisers and destroyers. Barnick twisted the wheel of the ship and shot the old duck back into the clouds, with no idea where to head for and how we would get there without the gas, close quote. Then Romulo writes, a quote, an idea broke clear and white in my brain. I reached deep into the dispatch case I had refused to throw overboard and dragged out a map that few people had ever seen except General Wainwright and General MacArthur. It was a map of the secret airfields in the Philippines. Many times since, I have asked myself why I went back to our headquarters just before leaving Corregidor and asked for that secret map. I've never been able to figure out why, but the map saved our lives. A little later, we were circling over a secret landing field on an island that must not be named. Lights flashed on 200 feet below. Wearily, the old duck lurched down to the ground. Her tank was almost dry. An hour later, we came down in the dawn on another field in Iloilo. It was the dawn of April 9. Iloilo was yet untouched by war. The story continues, quote, there was a little restaurant near the airport. We stumbled into it and had breakfast. Then after breakfast, Barnick and I found ourselves standing on the airfield, listening to a radio. It was the voice of freedom from the tunnel on Corregidor that I walked out of only a few hours before. It was Third Lieutenant Norman Reyes, one of my assistants, speaking. Bataan has fallen. The Philippine-American troops on this war-ravaged and blood-stained peninsula have laid down their arms. The message ended with the words, Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all the liberty-loving peoples of the world, cannot fall. We stood there on that airfield at Iloilo, an American flyer and a Filipino soldier, the tears running unashamedly down our cheeks. And we didn't give a damn who saw us cry, end quote. The fall of Bataan and the subsequent death march are among the most painful stories of both Philippine and American histories. Never before had the United States of America been so totally defeated in battle by a foreign adversary. Never before had America surrendered an army to an alien foe. Then, more than 60,000 starving and disease-stricken Allied prisoners were forced to march more than 60 miles to a prisoner of war camp by a Japanese army whose culture did not respect warriors who did not fight to the death or commit ritual suicide. Those prisoners who fell out of column, unable to continue, were simply shot or bayoneted, or in some cases trampled by trailing vehicles. Of the 78,000 Filipinos and Americans on the rolls of the USAFE Luzon Force on April 3, 1942, just a week earlier, only 54,000 were accounted for 2 months later. More than 21,000 had disappeared as a result of the fighting, the death march, and disease and starvation in the prison camp. From Iloilo, Romulo flew to Mindanao, and from there to Melbourne, Australia, where General MacArthur named him his aide-de-camp. It was there that he learned that he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for journalism in correspondence. For the next 2 years, the Philippine government in exile was based in the United States. For much of that time, Romulo, now a full colonel, visited all 50 states on an exhausting speaking tour, telling the American people the story of Bataan and Corregidor and the Philippine resistance movement. He was Secretary of Public Information in Quezon's War Cabinet. And this is the War Cabinet with Quezon at the TB Sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York. Quezon died of tuberculosis in August of 1944, less than 3 months before the re-invasion of the Philippines. Sergio Osmeña, shown here, was sworn in as president of the Philippines, and he promoted Romulo to brigadier general and appointed him resident commissioner to the United States. And then they both joined MacArthur to retake the Philippines. On October 20, 1944, Romulo walked ashore with MacArthur on the beach at Leyte. He recounts, quote, "In that moment of landing, I remembered something I had pledged myself to remember during 2.5 years of waiting. I remembered our Bataan dead who had been left unmarked, unburied, unavenged. I remembered them as I saw the American flag flying from a coconut tree, and beside it our own Filipino flag with its red and blue and its sun and 3 stars. That was my thought and my first prayer on Leyte Beach, that our long neglected dead might rest more easily that night on Bataan." End quote. After Leyte, the American Filipino forces campaigned northward and eventually, by February 1945, liberated Manila. Not before almost completely destroying it. The Romulo family was located behind enemy lines and rescued. And with the reunited family, Romulo returned to the United States to fulfill his duties as resident commissioner representing the Philippines. This is the family on arrival in the United States. My grandmother, Virginia, I fondly remember her as a very gracious lady, very refined lady. She passed away in 1968 from leukemia. Around a decade later, Carlos Romulo remarried an American writer named Beth Day. Now in her 90s, Beth still lives close to the Romulo family in the Philippines. All the boys graduated from Georgetown University. Carlos Jr., with the sunglasses here, tragically died in a small plane crash in the late 1950s. I never got to meet him. My late father, Gregorio, standing behind his mother here, got a PhD in economics or economic history and had a successful career as a management consultant. Ricardo, standing behind his father here, is the only surviving son. He went on to graduate summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and had his own illustrious career as one of the country's top corporate lawyers. Special mention here about little Roberto, Bobby, who just this January 2022 passed away at the age of 82. He distinguished himself in the business profession, becoming president and general manager of IBM in Thailand and IBM Philippines. He served as Philippine ambassador to Belgium and later became Secretary of Foreign Affairs, just like his father. He returned to the private sector and continued to lead Asia Pacific and Southeast Asian business councils and advised the Philippine president on international competitiveness. He co-founded the U.S. Philippines Society, which seeks to strengthen ties between the two countries. Just 2 months ago, on the floor of the U.S. Congress, March 2, 2022, Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia, the co-chair of the U.S.-Philippines Friendship Caucus, paid tribute to Ambassador Roberto Romulo, particularly for his efforts to deepen Philippine-U.S. relations. After signing the UN Charter for the Philippines in 1945, Carlos P. Romulo was a constant and vocal presence at the UN for the next 4 decades. And in 1981, he was awarded the UN Peace Medal. This is the United Nations Plaza in New York City. In December of 1985, I was in New York City when I learned of my grandfather's death in Manila. The very next day, the New York Times ran an extensive piece describing his life and career and praising his accomplishments. And I was amazed to see in the news later that day that these flags at the United Nations Plaza were all flown at half-mast. That was the end of a long and colorful life and career. And this is the end of my story. My thanks to the Norfolk Historical Society for allowing me to share it here tonight, and to all of you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fabulous. You're a wonderful storyteller,
Thank you.
and your grandfather was a powerful writer. I really see that Pulitzer Prize. Wow, he earned that. I feel like I was there in so many ways. I want to thank you for being with us, and also, gosh, I bet your grandfather's proud of you for honoring him in this way by keeping his story alive. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. We were lucky to be here tonight, and y'all, we taped this tonight. The program was recorded, so you can watch it again or share it with other people who had the misfortune of missing it. Wonderful story. It will be on our website within a few days once we get it posted, and you can access it through the Norfolk Historical Society website, which is norfolkhistorical.org. And that has all of our programs that have been recorded by Zoom, so you can go back and see some other ones too. Thank you so much for being with us. We've got so many people who are writing in congratulations and how great it was. So thank you again for being with us. Next month, we'll be back June 8th. Our speaker will be the Hampton Roads Naval Museum's Education Director, Laura Orr, who will speak to us on the Battle of Midway on the 80th anniversary of that World War II battle. And in July 13th, Charles Knight, who formerly was with the MacArthur Memorial, he's now military historian for the North Carolina History Museum in Raleigh, and he will talk to us about Virginian William Mahone, Billy Mahone, who was a politician, Virginia politician, a railroad entrepreneur, and a Confederate general. So we'll flip back to the 19th century for that one. And more programs are being planned for the rest of the year. So thank you again for joining us. Dr. Romulo, thank you again for an amazing program. And maybe we'll have your guitar society on sometime, the classical guitar. That would be a wonderful program. Thank you again, and I bid you all good night. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.